Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Reigning Threes podcast. I'm Julian, and I'm joined with my good friend Max. And today we're going to be talking about the 2000s. This is, of course, a continuation of our series of podcasts where we're going through each decade and just dissecting and talking about some players that we like. Make sure you also leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more NBA content. I'll pass it off to you, Max.
All right. So the first thing you need to know about the 2000s, and especially the early 2000s, from about 2000 to 2004-ish, I'd say, it's really not a fun era of basketball to watch. There is a lot of iso ball in terms of guard play, a lot of inefficient scoring, and even amongst the best teams in the league, there really isn't a lot of ball movement up until 2004. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, especially with iso ball and inefficient scoring, some of the players we're going to be talking about today are
Yeah.
definitely victims of that type of mentality.
Yeah, the four of the most isolation guys in the league I have written down. Allen Iverson, he's a career 42 from the field. Jerry Stackhouse, a career 41 from the field. Stephon Marbury, career 43%. Tracy McGrady, 43%. So a lot of these really good scoring guards from this era, they managed to get their points, but they definitely didn't do it on good efficiency, and that was definitely detrimental to their teams during this era.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I found is, again, especially in the era of 2000 to 2004, a lot of teams only really had 5 or 6 good players on their roster. A lot of teams were definitely very shallow at this time. A lot of older players were playing into their early 40s and late 30s just because there was a lack of talent in this era. And I think that part of it has to do with a lot of the players that were being drafted in this era. You have guys like Kwame Brown in the late 90s, Michael Olowokandi, Darko Milicic. And these are just guys that you don't really want to be drafting them in the top 10 if you're trying to build a successful franchise. And yet a lot of these guys were going very early in the draft.
Yeah, and another thing is a bunch of those guys were either high school players or international players.
Yep.
And especially during the 2000s, like high school was a big thing. Like a lot of teams were looking at high school prospects and trying to draft them because they thought that they'd be the next Kobe Bryant's and LeBron James's. But
Yep.
those picks eventually blew up in their face once they realized that they were rushed into a spot that they had no business being in.
I think with the European players especially, a lot of people had figured that if they drafted European big men who could shoot, that they'd automatically be getting the next Dirk Nowitzki. And as we see with guys like Darko Milicic, Nikolai Tishkavili, and later Andrea Bargnani, that really wasn't the case for a lot of these teams.
Yeah, and a bunch of people really like to talk about Dirk as this great international player, but let's not forget that when it was Dirk's first year in the league, he struggled a little bit and he was about to leave and go back to Europe. So there's
Yeah.
definitely more involved than just being from Europe and being a good shooter. It
Yeah.
comes down to being a good NBA player.
We kind of saw it with Giannis, where when Dirk came into the league, he was very raw, but the Dallas Mavericks and the Milwaukee Bucks later on, they put in all sorts of training assets and time within their organization into developing these players. And for both of them, it really has turned out beneficial. So I think a lot of teams didn't really put in the development necessary to turn their players into stars. But then in some cases, with guys like Tishkavili, they really just drafted them on the basis of figuring they could be Dirk, when in reality that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and speaking of Giannis, like they're both similar in a way. We'll talk about this more later, or we could even talk about it now. But Giannis is another player that kind of about to have a bunch of teams going over these new prospects just because
Yeah.
of Giannis's success. Like this came as early as in 2014, I believe, when the Raptors drafted Bruno Caboclo in the
Yep.
hopes that he could be the next Antetokounmpo. Like that certainly wasn't the case, but you're definitely going to see a lot of these long athletes that are going to get drafted just because teams think that they can just make them an automatic superstar, which is obviously not the case. Like you said, you need there's a lot of training and player development involved in order to make
Yep.
those players the great players that they are.
And I think a lot of the draft busts that were taken because of Dirk really kind of it made European players look really bad for a long time. And I think because of all these busts that were drafted on the basis of their talent being compared to Dirk, I think that's a big part of the reason why Luka Doncic didn't go first in 2018. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, when Luka got drafted, that was kind of a weird area for European talent, especially near the top, because the previous 2 years, Dragan Bender was drafted,
Yep.
Mario Hezonja was drafted, and like the last real European prospect that was drafted in the top was Kristaps Porzingis,
Yep.
and that's because he was 7'3" and had guard skills essentially. So
Yep.
yeah, that's definitely a main reason why Luka wasn't drafted number one. And then also a lot of scouts, they have more access to North American talent in college. It's easier to scout them than going to Madrid every other week
Yeah.
to see who to draft.
Yeah. But aside from the draft busts, I'd say, especially in the Eastern Conference in the 2000s, the talent pool was very limited. In the early 2000s, the New Jersey Nets made the finals twice. In 2003, the team only won 49 games, and in 2002, they won 52. But they didn't have a single player average more than 15 points. And I think that really points to the fact that in the early 2000s, the NBA as a whole was weaker in terms of the players who were in it and the talent amongst those players. And then later in the decade, while there certainly is more talent in the West with teams like the Lakers, the Spurs, the Suns, and then occasionally the Jazz and the Nuggets showed flashes, the East was still very weak late in the decade. Where when LeBron made the finals in 2007, as we've discussed, he had to play two 41 win teams and one 52 win team to get to that point. So the East as a whole really didn't have too much competition within it during the 2000s.
Yeah, and like you said, the talent was very watered down, and it was due to two factors. One, like the constant expansion at the time, especially like from the 80s to the 2000s. It
Yep.
went from a 22 league to a 32 league. So obviously that's going to water down talent a little bit, like especially with the Raptors coming in the late 90s and all that.
Yep.
And then also, like I mentioned earlier, the high school drafting players from high school, because
Yep.
what the league is essentially doing is it's getting younger and inexperienced,
Yep.
and the more younger and inexperienced guys you have that you put into a professional area, it kind of just makes the league this awkward phase. It was like an awkward phase in the league where the league didn't really have an identity
Yeah.
in the early 2000s.
I think it was really good when David Stern implemented the high school ban because that led to a lot more experience coming in. So when you drafted high school players, a lot of them did end up becoming busts, like Kwame Brown is the most notable example. But even after when you give them experience in university, in college, it really gives teams more of a chance to understand how they play against better competition. So I think that David Stern's decision to make that switch, it really helped the talent coming into the league and could showcase better talents as opposed to middling ones.
Yeah, I also think that like banning high school, it was good because if you actually look at the players that were drafted later, I'm not talking about the players like LeBron James and Kobe Bryant, who were obviously like superstars. LeBron, like almost when he came into the league right away, Kobe Bryant maybe like 2 or 3 years after. But typically some of the better high school players were the players that were drafted later in the draft, like Amir Johnson's and Lou Williams. And that's because they were put into a professional workplace where they weren't expected too much and they had
Yep.
to sit on the bench and just soak in knowledge. And I feel like that step between getting knowledge from better competition and
Yep.
actually playing in the pros is something that a bunch of people need. There's only a select handful of players I think could have made it the jump from high school to the NBA. And it's not that much because you also have to look at the body types that these high school kids had. Like every NBA player said that once they were like 21, 22, that's when their bodies were fully developed. And that's
Yep.
when they became stronger. So having 17-year-old kids put into a league is just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, when you look at the high school players who came in and right away were really good, most of them are tremendous athletes like LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, and then later on Dwight Howard. So I think with high school players, you have to give them the 2 to 3 years where they would have originally been in university. They need those years to develop into a functional player for their respective teams.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you look at T Mac and Kobe's careers, I think one of the main reasons why they were so successful is that they had like subpar rookie seasons,
Yep.
and they were able to play for organizations that kept them like on the bench and kind of kept them grounded and didn't expect too much from them. Obviously, T Mac, he didn't really have that long of a Raptors career, and he had maybe one good season until he went
Yeah.
to Orlando and was the man. But for Kobe Bryant, by his second year, he was already an all star.
Yeah. I think part of that it has to do with Kobe's work ethic, but I think that by not putting too much pressure on them, especially right off the bat, and just saying, just go out there and play. You don't have to be a superstar right away. It definitely gave them the leeway and the freedom necessary to eventually embrace a role as a star.
Yeah, and then there's also guys like Michael Candy who were just drafted off potential, right? Not
Yep.
really any skills, and Kwame Brown, for that matter.
Yep.
And that could be a pretty dangerous thing, drafting purely off potential.
Yeah. You always want to look for the guys who have at least bits of talent, like Dwight Howard did, because when you draft guys purely based off athleticism, it doesn't work more often than it does.
Yeah, for sure.
And then one other thing I have to note from the 2000s is a bunch of series were either theorized to have been rigged with good evidence against it or have been revealed to have been rigged, especially the 2002 series of Kings and the Lakers, where after going up 3-2 against the Lakers, the Kings suddenly had quadruple the amount of fouls called against them than the Lakers did, and which led to LA's defeat of them in 2002. And then also in 2006, the Miami Heat and Dallas Mavericks final series saw the Miami Heat and Dwayne Wade in particular getting a ridiculous amount of foul calls that didn't seem to be there. And so a lot of people think, and rightly so, after Tim Donaghy, the referee behind these games, admitted to cheating in front of a grand jury, that a lot of games from this era were rigged. Do you think that's a substantial claim, or do you think it's nonsense?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the Kings Lakers series, just seeing like the overwhelming amount of fouls that were called on the Kings, it I mean it I think the evidence is pretty conclusive that something was going on. I don't know if the games were completely rigged because of course like the Lakers were still a good team back then. It's not like they were a terrible team.
Yeah.
But I don't even know like who it would be rigged for. Would it be rigged by the NBA because it
Well, the
would boost
thing,
ratings, or is it based off the refs? Because like you said, Tim Donaghy was getting paid off by these mafia bosses.
yeah, a lot of people think, and I personally agree with this, that if the NBA did they would have good reason to, because that year, if the Kings did beat the Lakers, the final series would have been Sacramento versus New Jersey, both of which aren't the biggest markets, and for the casual fan, aren't the teams you really want to see in the finals. So I think that the NBA may have been involved definitely in that instance, but for the other ones, it may have been outside factors that determined it.
Yeah. And I mean, another thing that I'm kind of skeptical a little bit when it comes to these NBA riggings is just like the fact that a bunch of teams out of the East were able to make it that weren't really big market teams either.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, it's definitely an interesting theory.
Yep.
And obviously, like Tim Donaghy, like adds a whole different dimension
Yep.
into this conversation, but I'm not sure.
I think it deserves a deep dive for sure, but it's one of those things where until someone comes out from the league or from one of the referees who was involved, perhaps, that it's going to be almost impossible to confirm or deny whether or not it happened.
Yeah, 100%.
So all in all, I'd say the era of the 2000s, it was a pretty weak era in terms of basketball. There wasn't a lot of scoring, especially early in the decade. Most games were in the 90s, which is, as a fan, it's not the thing you want to see. There's pretty weak talent and a lot of draft busts. So, all in all, I'd just say it was a pretty middling era for the NBA. Definitely worse than its predecessors, and a whole lot worse than the following 2010s. Would you agree?
Yeah, and one thing I would like to add when it comes down to the 2000s and like the overall game style, I feel like the 2000s was that one era that had an overwhelming amount of athletes,
Yep.
but not enough talented players.
Yep.
Um, and when I say that, I mean right now, in kind of this renaissance of basketball, where everyone's shooting threes, every team's making threes, and court spacing is through the roof. To see the way that the court was spaced back then, here, I think I can make a little graphic for the people watching. So right now, in the typical NBA, it's either a 5 out where you have the guy, the point guard up top, and then you have everyone else on the corners of the three, or you have a big man a big man inside the paint. Okay? Right now, but in the 2000s, you'd always have two big men in the paint, one guy around mid-range level,
Yep.
ball handler, and a guy on the three-point line.
Yeah.
And when you think about the amount of athletes there on both teams, there's incredible athletes on defense that
Yep.
can block your shot, whatever. And also, these athletes that can't shoot are usually the guys going into the paint. So
Yep.
it's just going to make a whole bunch of congested basketball.
Yeah, definitely. I think eventually, as some of the better drafts of the decade, especially 2003, came along, that really shifted from athletes with no talent to just all around talent and still some athleticism. But definitely earlier in the decade, there was a striking lack of talent, and most players were just in the athletic kind of build.
Yeah.
So, anyways, with that in mind, first thing we need to say is who is your team of the decade?
Okay, so my team of the decade, I kind of had a similar approach as last podcast, where I tried doing a combination of putting players in the right position as well as making a team that fits together.
Yep.
So, with that being said, my first team consists of Steve Nash. I mean, that goes without saying. Two-time MVP in the decade, multiple-time All-Star and assist champ. He's
Yep.
almost a perfect point guard to play with, especially if you have a bunch of volume shooters on your team,
Yep.
because he'll just throw outlet passes, especially that Phoenix Suns team with the
Yep.
7 seconds or left offense. Steve Nash was able to turn a regular half court set into a fast break like that.
Yep.
So he's
He when
definitely
he
my
went
point guard on the first
when
team.
he went to Phoenix, he really revolutionized both how offenses are run as well as just the ceiling of that team. I'm pretty sure that a lot of their players, after Nash went to their team, they increased their points per game and field goal percentage. Am I correct?
Yeah, 100%. And some guys even became all stars.
Yep. And then I looked it up. His first year in Phoenix, the Suns averaged 7 more points per game than the next team in the league. If that was in today's last year's NBA season, it would have been equivalent to the Milwaukee Bucks averaging 125 points per game, which is insane to think about because right when he came in, they went from this iso ball heavy style with Stephon Marbury running the point to a really run and gun team that has this great offense, and it really set the build for how offenses are ran today. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, watching some Phoenix Suns highlights, I definitely see a lot of 4 out, 1 in action, and even some 5 out plays being run.
Yep. I think that without the Suns, it would. I think the NBA still would have became the league it is today in terms of 3-point shooting as just a natural progression. But at the same time, I think their success it really kickstarted just how popular that style became amongst teams.
Yeah, I also mean, if you look at Nash's game, it was his offensive game was so simple yet complicated.
Yeah.
Um, like when he run the pick and rolls with Amari Stoudemire.
Yep.
Amari Stoudemire was almost a perfect role partner because oftentimes, since Nash was such a great shooter from anywhere on the court, he'd use that as a decoy and take a step back mid range and would go in almost every time just
Yep.
because he was that good and that efficient. and he was like a deceptively good scorer. Even though
Yeah.
I don't even think he's had a season where he's averaged over 20 points per game. That's because that wasn't his role. Scoring wasn't his role. His role was facilitating and making sure that the offense and everyone's included.
Yeah, he always got a bit of flack for not his inability to score, but just because he chose not to. And I think it's really unfair because his team was better at times as a result of him being able to get everyone the ball and make sure that everyone on his team was happy and that they were all scoring. So I think a lot of the criticism for his lack of scoring, and especially when people use that as a reason to deny him his two MVPs, I just think it's really unfair.
Yeah, and I mean Steve Nash was definitely a guy that if he wanted to, he could give you 25 to 30 a night.
Yep.
Um, or any on any given night. I mean, there's some games in the playoffs where you go bonkers and score like 45 points. I
Yep.
mean, he was really the best point guard in that decade and one of the
Yeah.
best point guards of all time.
And he really was efficient. His turnovers for a guy getting 10 plus assists on an annual basis, they weren't that high. And he also was part of the 50, 40, 90 club twice, if I'm not mistaken.
Um,
And
Let me
regardless
verify that. I think it's a little bit more than twice.
regardless of that fact, he was always efficient on the court. He took good shots, and most of the time when he took his shots, they went in more than often than not from wherever he was on the court.
Um, yeah, I could confirm it was like 5 times. He was in the
Yeah,
50, 40, 90 club.
yeah.
And there's a couple times where he was point 0.1 away from free throw to
It's
make
insane.
it. So
It's insane to think about it, where most players are one-time inclusions or two times, but Nash, like you said, five times, I believe you said.
yeah,
It's
5 times. And
just
he could have made it a little bit more as well.
just insane to think about how on pretty high volume he was still able to do that.
Yeah, and it's not like he was like taking a limited amount of threes. He was taking about like 3.5 to 4 threes per game. So
Yep,
sometimes even like 4.5 and above.
yep,
So especially in an era where teams only shot like 25 threes a game,
yep,
I mean that's pretty good. And to convert 40+% of the time, that's extremely good.
yep. So that's your point guard. Who's your shooting guard?
So my shooting guard, this one, it goes without saying, probably the best player in this decade, the late
Yep,
great Kobe Bryant. I
yep,
mean, just as like an offensive player, he was stellar. Um, and then one thing that doesn't get talked about enough is how great he was on the defensive side of the ball.
yep,
Obviously, he's tied for most All NBA, or I mean all defensive team first teams.
yep,
So he was definitely another guy that he could guard the other team's best player, but also light up the other team's best defender.
yep. I agree that his defense really goes under the radar because he was a 15-time all defense and he could guard pretty much anyone on the court. So I think his scoring, just because of his natural ability and the way he did it, really took people. Like that's kind of what people recognize about him. But his defense at the same time was on par with his scoring ability as well.
Yeah, and I mean the only thing that you could really knock him on, or two things really, his lack of finals MVPs when it comes down to the GOAT conversation, considering that he didn't win finals MVP when he had Shaq, but at the same time he was a champion. He was a second option on a
Yep.
championship team. And also his amount of regular season MVPs. Um, Obviously there was a time where Kobe was playing with players that weren't too good. Um,
Yeah.
and that would result in being a lower seed,
Yep.
thus making him not the MVP because usually the MVP is given to the first or second seed in the conference.
Yeah.
And a lot of people like to talk about how he was robbed with Nash. I personally don't believe that, but
Yep.
he definitely could have had a little bit more MVPs.
Yeah. I think that when you consider just his team record in those years compared to the guys who did win MVP, he has the right amount in terms of in the years with Nash, where he was averaging 35 points a game, Nash was the number one seed. One of those years, Kobe didn't make the playoffs, and the other year, they were a sixth seed. So you can't really give it to the guy who's scoring more than the guy who's actually leading to wins. But at the same time, you definitely could make the case for Kobe having more MVPs than he does. especially later in the decade in 2008 and maybe even 2007, where he had these great scoring seasons and his team was actually winning as a result of that. But other than that, I think he's fairly ranked in terms of MVPs all in all.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing, um, when I was like researching, just because I always want to find the context of each
Yep.
era, like what the popular belief or what the mindset was during that season. Because obviously, it's easy for a bunch of 12-year-olds to look at Kobe's stats that year. Oh, he scored 36 points per game. He should
Yeah.
have been MVP. But the mindset around the attitude in that time was Nash. He just lost his second best player,
Yep.
Amari Stoudemire, due to injury, and he was able to carry the Suns to the same record that they were projected to have,
Yeah.
while scoring more and just being overall better,
Yep.
statistically. So I think that's the main reason why Nash won his second MVP.
Yep.
And a lot of people like to look at Russell Westbrook's MVP and be like, "Oh, he was a sixth seed." But the thing is, you can't really compare Westbrook and Kobe's because Westbrook's happened 10 years after Kobe's season.
Yeah.
It's unfair to bring up a player that wasn't even in the league at the time.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is the narratives for both of them are really far off. For Westbrook, the narrative was Kevin Durant is gone. He led a team that he has no one around him to the playoffs, and he did it while averaging a triple double. But with Kobe, the narrative at the time, especially in 2006, was he forced Shaq off this team. He's a ball hog who doesn't pass the ball, and he doesn't necessarily lead to that many wins. And a lot of people in sports media, from what I read at the time, kind of thought he was a prima donna because there were stages where he did demand a trade and he was looking to move on from LA. So I think that a big part of the reason why a guy like Westbrook won it and Kobe didn't was because of the narratives associated with them at their respective times.
Yeah, and I mean the narrative, it's another thing that's crucial when you look at it because at the end of the day the media is the ones that are voting for these awards.
Yep.
And if you're looking at the narrative for Steve Nash's first MVP, you have a point guard that was kind of iffy on Dallas. I mean, he was an all-star, but there were certain points in his career where even the Dallas fans didn't like him that much.
Yep.
And he's going on to the Suns team that was like a 27-win team, makes them a 62-win team, and carries them, averages the most assists that the league's seen since Stockton,
Yep.
and Mark Jackson, like those types of players. I mean, it's kind of hard not to give it to him.
Yep. And I think that, especially looking back on it now and just seeing the way the league has progressed in terms of shooting, and just the fact that Nash and the Suns were really the ones who kickstarted it, I think that just really cases his MVP case because the things he was able to do on the court and turning 3-point shot into taking it from kind of a it's there but no one's really going to use it into something that is necessary for the game for your game to have. I think that really solidifies his case as the MVP and the first team all decade in his position.
Yeah. So now moving on to my small forward, I have LeBron James. This one, it was a little hard because I wanted to move Kobe to the small forward and put Allen Iverson. But when you look at LeBron James, he was basically a top five player ever since his second season in the NBA. And he was the best player in the league, during the late 2010s, or if not best, second best behind Kobe Bryant.
Yep.
And I mean, he's another player, goes without saying. He's all decade for 2 decades.
Yep.
And he's the best player. He's the player of the decade for another one,
Yep.
which is the 2010. So you have to give it to him. Even if you didn't have his 2010 career, I'd still take LeBron over any of those other guys, below him.
Yep. Most definitely. With LeBron, even though he didn't have the same kind of clutch gene that he now has or the consistent ability to dominate everyone in terms of playoff performance, he still was a top scorer who could come in. There were very few guys that could guard him. He took, even though the East was weak, he still took them to the finals, which is it's something that is an accomplishment. And in addition, he was always made those Cavs teams competitive, regardless of the fact who he had around him.
Yeah. And now my power forward, I have Tim Duncan. This is another one which it goes without saying.
Yes.
He's a top 10 player all time, and he did a lot of his damage in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And he was just that one player that can do it all, really, at center. Um, Obviously, he won multiple championships during
Yep.
this era and multiple finals MVPs. He was an MVP, two-time MVP
Yep.
in this decade. Um, I think he was an all-star every single year as well. Yeah,
He
he was
was.
an all-star every single year in that decade. Pretty durable, barely got injured.
Yep.
And he's just one player that people don't really appreciate his game as much
Yeah.
now.
I think a big part of that has to do with just his style, where it's not the most appealing style to watch, but it's effective. So while that got the Spurs decades of winning and success, as a fan, it's not the thing you really want to see. And that reflects in the least watched finals games of all time. Or some of them are the Duncan LeBron finals in 2007, just because Duncan's style, it's really not that entertaining to watch.
Yeah, and I mean, like, if you watch Tim Duncan highlights now, you could search up Tim Duncan career highlights, and it's almost the same thing. He gets the ball on the left side, moves to the right, and does a hook moving on the right side.
Yep.
Um, but I think that also shows how great he is because he was able to do that for like almost 20 years.
Yeah.
Same
His
move every time.
his longevity and the fact that there was no point in his career where he really wanted out of San Antonio. He was always a good sport, always took them to 50 wins. I think that really solidifies his spot on the top 10 all time. And personally, I think he's the best from this decade over Kobe. They're one and two for sure. But I think with Duncan, just his ability to stay level throughout the decade, where unlike Kobe, he doesn't have these really high ups, but then really low lows. I think his overall consistency, where he wins in 2003, 5, and 7, I think that really propels him to the tops of players in this decade.
Yeah, and I mean when you also look at like his playoff stats, he's always elevated his game.
Yep.
Especially when he like won championships. Like there's some playoff series where he'd average like 25, 15, and 5 with like 3 blocks per game.
Yeah.
That was in 2003. Like in 2005, he averaged 24, 12, and 2 with like
Yep.
2.3 blocks. He was just a solid all around player that can block shots, get rebounds, and just do all the right things.
Yeah. Do you want to hear his stats from the 2003 finals against New Jersey?
Before you say, is this the series where he had 5 blocks by any
This
chance?
is this is the series. In the series, he averaged 24 points, 17 rebounds, 5 assists, and 5 blocks a game. Those are, for any player, absolute ridiculous numbers to put up. And I think this series really was his peak as a player, but it just shows how he could dominate both ends of the court. For a big man, he had a keen eye in moving the ball. And at the same time, no matter what you did, you really couldn't stop him. Even though his game wasn't the flashiest, there's just nothing you could really do to prevent him from being effective on the court.
Yeah, and I mean like he was an all-star like up until like his last year. I mean when he was 20 or 38, he was an all-star.
Yeah.
When he was 36, he was an all-star, and when he was 37, he won a ring.
Yep.
So I mean like he just had a solid career. Like it was just consistently solid.
Yep.
He never had any low years where he just absolutely regressed.
Yep.
He was always consistent.
Yeah. And with him, his defense was amazing. Like Kobe, he's a 15-time all defender. I'd say he's probably the greatest defensive player to never win Defensive Player of the Year award, just because every year he'd get 2 blocks and around to steal a game. Was always effective and could guard anyone in the post. And he even took on bigger guys than him, like Shaq, late early in his career. So I think because of that, he probably deserved a defensive player, but because of some circumstances, he just never won one.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on to my center, I have Shaq, which that's another player. I mean, this whole first team, it kind of is pretty self-explanatory.
Yep.
Like Shaq, obviously, he started off the 2000s with a three-peat.
Yep.
Um, and I mean, it doesn't get better than that. Three finals MVPs. He moves to Miami in 2006. He becomes the second option along with Dwayne Wade for
Yep.
that championship. Um, and he was just an all-star throughout the whole decade.
Yep.
Probably one of the greatest centers of all time, top three or four,
Yep.
depending on what you value in a center.
Yep. I
And
think
solid.
he was really good, and his defense was solid as a shot blocker around the rim. Solid passing vision. But the thing about his game is, when he was on, there was nothing you could do to stop him from getting into the paint, pushing whoever was in his way, and just throwing down on anyone in front of him.
Yeah, absolute beast.
Yep. And
Anyway, for you, did you have any changes to the list or?
I had one change. Instead of Steve Nash at point guard, I did the old move up players and I put Kevin Garnett at 3. With Garnett, he had an MVP season in the decade. He won a ring in the decade and he made the finals once where he lost with the Boston Celtics. For me, the choice really just has to do with their success as a player and the fact that Garnett does have a title. Both of them are tremendous players. With Garnett, he was a good rival to guys like Duncan and Amari Stoudemire and Shaquille O'Neal. Minnesota Timberwolves were a solid team for up until about 2004, where they made the conference finals. But Garnett was obviously a superstar player. As of now, he's the only player to be top 50 in points, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks. And that's just a testament to his all-around ability to do anything on the court in his given role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Garnett was on my second team, but let's hear it from you. What do you have on your second team?
To start my second team, I have Steve Nash, as we discussed. Tremendous point guard, definitely the point guard of the decade, amazing playmaker. And if it was for some circumstances with the Suns and the fact that they routinely cheaped out on players, he probably would have been a finalist at least during this decade. But after Steve Nash, I have Jason Kidd, who most notably played for the New Jersey Nets and Dallas Mavericks. During the decade, he was a 2-time finalist in New Jersey. He was a routine All-Star, All-NBA, and he should have been All-Defense. I think he was. And then later on in his career in 2011 with the Mavericks, he did go on to win a title. With Kidd, he's kind of like Steve Nash, where he did have this ability to run an offense, could score in the paint a fair bit, and later in his career developed a good three-point shot. But really with him, he was able to run the fast break in a Nash-esque way. But during his era, there really wasn't anyone like that. So he was really a unique player in the early 2000s before Nash came along in Phoenix, where he could run an offense and run a fast break with these athletes in New Jersey. And that led to success in terms of them making the finals twice.
Yeah, I mean Jason Kidd, he was another great player, great playmaker, and yeah, he was an elite defender as a point guard. He was a 9-time All Defensive Team
Yep.
player, which is insane for any player, but even better for a point guard.
Yep.
And I see this debate a lot, whether it's between Steve Nash and Jason Kidd. And in my opinion, I don't think it's even close. I think Steve Nash is way better. But one thing that does uh, put Kidd over Nash is definitely his defense.
Yeah.
Um,
They're both different in terms of just how they scored their points, where Kidd, while he could score, he didn't do it efficiently. He has a career field goal percentage of 40% compared to Nash, who was 50, 40, 90 on a routine basis. But the thing is, they're both, we could say, even playmakers,
I
or
think
Nash
Nash
is
is a
a
little
little
bit
better.
better. But
Yeah. But with scoring, Nash has the benefit, and with defense, Kidd does. And so when it comes to that, I think Nash and how he revolutionized basketball, I think that really gives him the nod over Kidd.
yeah, I mean that's why Nash is on my first team and Kidd is on my second team. But they're
Yeah.
definitely comparable players, and at certain times, people thought that one was better than the other.
Yep. It was definitely kind of like a later on Chris Paul versus Darren Williams for a while, where you had a group of fans in one park and then a group of fans for the other. But all in all, I think Nash is definitely the better player in this scenario. So after those two, my small forward, who would never play small forward during his career, but it's Allen Iverson, as we discussed. He was probably, besides Kobe, the best scoring player of the decade. Could score from anywhere on the court, inside the 3-point line. Was a smart defender who could get steals but couldn't lock anyone down. But the thing about Iverson was he was just a transcendent scoring player who really kind of despite the fact that he was a very short player, most people think he's under 6 feet tall, was still able to generate wins and make a finals appearance based on his scoring ability.
Yeah, I mean Iverson, he's one of those players that in today's game, I don't think he would really fit in
Yeah.
as a primary option.
Yep.
And he would end up having the same fate that he had in his career, where he was a great player, he was an MVP, multiple like 3 times scoring champ, but
Yep.
never won a championship. And that's just because of how inefficient he was as a scorer. He had
Yep.
multiple years in his prime where he shot under 40%,
Yep.
which as a superstar is something that is unacceptable.
Yep.
And like, don't get me wrong, I think as a talent, like when it comes to skill, like his ability to handle the ball,
Yep.
and score and break apart defenders, that's not easy. But the thing is, like, in order to be one of the best players in the league, he has to be more efficient.
Yeah. And the other thing about him was he never was a shooter by any means from three. And he was really the first player to kind of get a ball hog label assigned to him because while he didn't really have too much talent around him, he never even tried to make them better. It was always with him, it was always about looking out for him and looking for his shots. And that carried over to Denver, where when it was him and Carmelo Anthony, they got knocked off fairly early in the playoffs because it was just those two playing ISO ball all the time and it didn't lead to any success. But then after they traded Iverson for Chauncey Billups, they made the conference finals because they had more ball movement and more defense. So I think Iverson, in his limited passing and efficiency, it really held him back at times.
Yeah, and I mean Iverson, he did average like 7 assists, 8 assists, in some of his seasons when he was in Philadelphia. But the thing is, I think that's less of creating shots for your teammates and more of him getting double teamed
Yes.
and him just kicking it out.
Yeah, I think it's like Russell Westbrook and James Harden, where just because they're averaging 8 plus, 7 plus assists a game, it doesn't really reflect their ability to lead an offense or pass the ball. Because, like you said, in some cases it's more about double teams. In other cases, it's more about hunting for assists. So I think with Iverson, it's more a result of, like we said, just being double teamed. The guy's open under the basket, and you just hit him when he's open, kind of thing.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, like you said, James Harden and Westbrook, those are two like key examples. And all those guys are good like playmakers. They definitely have good court awareness and court vision. But the
Yep.
thing is, playmaking isn't their primary mindset.
No.
And especially when you have the ball in your hands for so long, you're
Yep.
bound to get those assists.
Yep.
That's what's different between Harden. I believe Harden got 11 assists one year,
Yep.
and Nash getting 11 assists. Nash was able to get those 11 assists without the ball being in his hands as much as
Yep.
like Harden is, because obviously when you're getting double teamed and you have the ball for half the game, you're bound to pass it to a wide open guy.
Yep. It's just natural almost. It'd be kind of hard not to get that amount if you didn't. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, you named your small forward.
Yep. So after Iverson, once again, a player who would never play power forward in his career, but he's second team nonetheless. It's Dwayne Wade for the Miami Heat. During the decade, he was All NBA. He won a title and was the Finals MVP, and he was the scoring champion in I believe 2009 or 2008. Throughout the decade, he was a really good player. Could score the ball. Really good defender. I think he leads shooting guards all time in terms of block numbers. He was a good scorer, a good playmaker, and a solid rebounder for his position. And like we saw in 2006, whether or not that finals was potentially rigged or not, nonetheless, he still won the series, and he was the best player for the Heat during that stretch of games. So I think he definitely deserves it, especially because he was more efficient than a lot of the other big scorers in this decade, where he was shooting around 45, 46%, whereas other guys were a little lower in that category.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of Dwayne Wade, I just think of overall solid player, super athletic,
Yep.
and basically good at everything minus like 3-point shooting, really.
Yep.
Um, three-time all defense as a guard, especially like these superstar guards. This is what like kind of separates the really good scorers and the all-time legends. Just his ability to win championships and also his ability to defend.
Yep.
That's why you have guys like Larry Bird, LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. They're all up there because they all had all defensive seasons. And Dwayne Wade's just a level below those guys.
Yep.
One thing that I want to touch on Dwayne Wade's defense is I was watching his highlights not too long ago, and it was a game where I believe he scored like 48 points against the Chicago Bulls in 2009,
Yep.
where he hit that one-legged three-game winner.
Won it off a steal.
Yeah, off a steal from former Raptor John Salmons. Anyway, the commentator actually said this is where Wade's time to shine. Usually you see in these situations he gets a block or a steal. So
Yep.
just knowing, like the commentator basically knowing what's going to happen in a certain situation just really
Yep.
shows how elite of a defender he really was.
Yeah. And he really played with intelligence on the court where he could see where guys were going to be cutting or shooting. And on defense, he was able to make really good reads and reactions and make really good plays based on those in the moment.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people say that Dwayne Wade is one of the best players to never win an MVP.
Yeah. He's,
And
he's definitely up there.
And a lot of people say, oh, he should have won in 2009, the same year LeBron won it. Dwayne Wade was third in MVP voting, and he had the second most first team or first place votes.
Yep.
But obviously, LeBron took like basically almost won unanimously.
Yep.
Or not almost, but he was the clear cut option that season.
Yep. Anyways, after Dirk, my center is Dirk Nowitzki. He was a tremendous talent throughout the decade, an amazing shooter. He really revolutionized what 7-footers could do in terms of shooting ability. And like we said, his talent inspired a lot of draft busts to come later on, but it also inspired a lot of Europeans to also come over and play in the NBA. Tremendous talent. He won MVP in 2007, made the finals in 2006 where he lost in 6 games. And I think with him, the only reason he's on my second team, in terms of talent, he's up there with Duncan and Garnett. But in the 2000s, in the back half of the decade, when he wins MVP in 2007, they get knocked out in the first round by, we believe, Warriors. And then in the next following years, he always gets knocked off fairly early in the playoffs. So I think just because of his kind of lows of the decade, I think that demotes him to the second team in terms of his, just despite his talent, he really didn't have that too much success in the playoffs later in the decade.
Yeah. My list is a little bit different, but also very similar. Um, so instead of having Nash as the point guard and Wade as my power forward, I did move Wade down a couple slots, but I had Jason Kidd, who we already talked about, great defender.
Yep.
Allen Iverson, we already talked about him, great scorer. Dwayne Wade, great all-around player and athlete. Dirk, you just mentioned.
Yep.
And then I have Kevin Garnett, who is another player we talked about.
Yep.
And really, I just flipped Kevin Garnett with Steve Nash.
Yep.
And yeah, KG, he was a monster for a good amount of his career, up until like some of his later years in Brooklyn, and then like eventually when he moved back to Minnesota. But in his Celtics and Timberwolves years, he was a monster. Obviously, he won MVP during this decade and a championship. He didn't win Finals MVP. That, of course, went to Paul Pierce. We'll talk about a little bit later. But he was just overall a very solid player, can score. He had a pretty good mid-range game for a power forward, for a big man. And, yeah.
He could really do it. He could really do it all on the court, and I think that really helps solidify him as one of the best players of the decade.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on to our third and final team. I'll just name some of my guys, and then this is probably the one where we have the most differences in, just
Yep.
because here's where the talent starts to even out a little bit, and essentially it also comes down to preference, really, because there's so many good players to choose from.
Yep.
But my point guard, it's going to be Tony Parker.
Yep.
Solid point guard. He won Finals MVP in this decade, I believe, in 2007.
Yep.
Just on the third best point guard in this decade, just a little bit under Kidd and Nash. Probably one of the better scoring point guards, but he also was like just not as good as them.
Yeah.
The second guy I have at the two guard is Tracy McGrady.
Yep.
This was tough putting T-Mac in over other players, just based off the fact that like his prime was so short.
Yeah.
Where he had those 2 seasons in Orlando where he was killing it, and then he was off to a small decline, and also his lack of team success.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing with him, where up until his year in San Antonio, where he didn't even play except for, I think, 5 or 6 games, he never made it out of the first round. And even when they were in the playoffs, they were always a pretty easy out. And I think that kind of shows not really his problems, but I think a lot of it had to do with his overall teams. In Orlando, his second best player was Grant Hill, who, as we talked about in our last video, was routinely injured, and so they never really got to live up with each other. And then him and Yao had clashing play styles with one another, so I think just the teams around him really kind of held him back in terms of success in his years in Orlando and Houston.
Yeah, and I mean, he was also one shot away from being an NBA champion when he was on San Antonio, but that, of course, would still not really um, mean too much. I
Yeah,
mean, he would be known as a player that won a ring, but I heard him say on a podcast, I believe it was the Knuckle, no, all the Smoke podcast. T Max said that he would decline his ring,
yeah,
um, even if he won. So yeah, his team success was definitely one of the bigger knocks on his career.
yep,
Um, then at the small forward, I have Paul Pierce. Um, in this position, I was debating between 3 players. It was either him, Carmelo Anthony, or Ray Allen,
yep,
and I chose him just because he was Finals MVP that year where him and Ray Allen played, and
yeah,
there was some years where he was just spectacular um,
yeah. With
offensively.
with those three, they're all really similar, where they could all score a lot of points. None of them were really great ball movers, and none of them were really great defenders. But Pierce, really, I think what you're going for is just because of the Finals MVP, which it's fair. And he was definitely a great player in terms of his scoring ability. He's on my list too. He was a good shooter. He's not as great as he says he is,
Oh
but
yeah.
nonetheless, he was still a pretty good player in the decade.
Yeah, and I mean the debate I had between him and Melo was Melo averaged more points, but Paul averaged more rebounds and assists, and he was also there the whole decade and was a 7-time All-Star, I believe.
Yep,
Melo was only a 2-time All-Star during that time period.
yep,
So that's another kind of knock on Melo, I guess, for the decade.
yeah,
Um, Although he did have great seasons in the 2000s, it just wasn't enough. And then,
yep,
yeah, the Finals MVP is kind of what separated between him and Ray Allen, and
yep.
just the fact that when Ray Allen came to the Celtics, he had to take a step back to Paul Pierce, um, which is like another thing, like not a knock on Ray Allen himself, but it just elevates Pierce.
Yeah, both of them, when you look at their career trajectory, they're both about the same until Allen went to Miami, where early in their careers they were amazing scorers. I believe they both made one conference finals appearance, Allen with the Bucks and Pierce with the Celtics. And then for a few years after that, they're on middling teams that sometimes they make the playoffs, sometimes they don't. They're easy outs in the playoffs, and then they go to Boston together, win that ring, and then the rest is history. But I think that, like you said, the Finals MVP is just what sets him apart from Ray Allen.
Hmm. Yeah, and then at the power forward, this one was hard. I was debating like my power forward and center.
Yep,
I was debating whether to put other players that I think you have on your list.
yep,
So at the power forward, I have Dwight Howard.
yep.
Just because my center is 7'6", which is a good hint. But and he also played power forward
Is it
in his first 2 years in
is it
Orlando.
is your 7'6" center Sean Bradley?
Oh no, it's George Mir. No, but he didn't even play in the 2000s anyway. But Dwight Howard, this one it was kind of hard to put him on,
Yeah,
but at the same time, like near the end of the 2000s, that's kind of when Dwight was like nearing his peak
yeah,
player on the Orlando Magic. I believe he had a couple defensive player of the years
yeah.
during this time,
He had
as well
two.
as rebound
Yep,
champs.
yep.
And he was just one of the better centers in the league. And near the end of the 2000s, he was considered a top 5 player.
Yeah.
So I think you have to put him just because his peak was higher than some of the other players that missed out.
Yeah, nowadays we think of him as kind of a goofball, but he led his team to a finals appearance. So I think that really gets a little forgotten about because he was the best player on a team that beat a healthy Cavaliers team with LeBron, who I'm pretty sure won 60 plus games that year. And he took them to the finals where he competed with Kobe. I mean, they went 5 games, but in one of those games, there was a missed layup at the buzzer to win the game for the Magic. So it was a tighter series than a lot of people remember. So I think Dwight Howard definitely deserves that with his defensive dominance and his success later in the decade, in from 2008 to 2010 especially.
Yeah, and I think one thing that Dwight gets a bad rap for is his career after Orlando,
Yeah,
where when he was playing in LA and Houston, he was still an all-star, but it just wasn't the same.
yeah,
And I think that kind of is the reason why a lot of people don't respect him as a player um, too much.
yep,
But like when you look at his stats, he was a great rebounder,
yep,
a pretty good scorer for a big man.
yep,
Although like it was mostly off like just pure physicality and
yeah.
lobs, but still, nonetheless, a very solid player.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why people kind of don't like him is he was the pick and roll guy who was getting 20 points off offensive boards and pick and rolls, and he never really did develop a post game. And that's kind of what held him back in LA and Houston, where he was expected to get post shots and score on defenders, but he just never could. And then the other thing is with Dwight, he was a great defensive player, but he pioneered something that I hate, and that's the block out of bounds. I don't know if he doesn't realize that if you block a ball straight out of bounds, the team who just shot the ball will just get another chance to score. And I think that he was a great defensive player, obviously, no doubt. But it really just annoys me to see a guy block it out of bounds because then the team can just get it back and they have another chance to score. So just just keep it in bounds, man. I mean, but yeah, he's definitely a tremendous player who deserves to be on the all decade team.
Yeah, and then my center, this one it might be controversial, but at the same time, it's not really. It's
Yeah.
Yao Ming. Obviously 7'6", uh, basically dominated just because of his height.
Yep.
He gave a lot of stars problems, like he gave Shaq problems, um, and like he was a solid player. I mean, I've seen pictures of him next to other NBA players, and the players look like babies next to him.
Yeah.
Like
Was
there's
he was
one where it was with Luka Doncic and Dirk Nowitzki. Yao
yeah.
was next to them,
Yep.
and like some people genuinely believe that Yao is 8 feet tall.
He,
When you look at the pictures between him and Dirk, so
yeah.
it's interesting to see. But
Yeah. He had a lot of for a guy that tall, he did have a lot of finesse around the rim where he had a post fade away. He was crafty with the ball, but he was really held back by his body where he only had 6 or 7 good years because of injuries later in his career. and also the fact that being 7'6", he was slow. So I think that really held back his game where he couldn't really make decisions, not because of his talent or ability, but just because he was such a lumbering presence on the court.
Yeah, and another thing, just like an interesting stat to point out,
Yep.
is that Yao Ming is the only player in NBA history that has never missed an All-Star game in his career.
Yeah. I find that especially funny because in one of those years where he did make All-Star game, he only played 5 games, right? Yeah, so I'm sure it had something to do with fan vote, but he was definitely a great player in his prime. Again, the same thing with McGrady, where if he had better or more fitting talent around him, he probably could have made a deep postseason run, but just because of circumstance and the fit between him and McGrady, it just never really worked out.
Yeah, and there's other players I wanted to put on this list, like Ben Wallace,
Yep.
just because of his dominance on defense and on the boards, as
Yeah.
well as like the fact that he won championships during that decade.
Yep.
But nonetheless, I just thought since it was the last spot on the third team, I give it to Yao.
Yeah. So for me, I have Tracy McGrady. I have Paul Pierce. We talked about Ray Allen. He is on my team for his shooting ability, his scoring ability, especially because he was really athletic when he was in Milwaukee, and he was even in the dunk contest. And just the fact that throughout the decade, he was always a really good player, was consistent in his scoring throughout, and he was up until Steph Curry's renaissance with the Warriors. He was the greatest shooter of all time. And then after those two, my big men differ from you. My power forward is Chris Webber, who most notably played for the Sacramento Kings. During the decade, he was a 4-time All-NBA, including one All-NBA first. He was a 4-time All-Star, and he was the closest to beating the Shaq and Kobe Lakers up until the Detroit Pistons. Him and those Kings teams, they really were a good team, centered around him, Peja Stojakovic, Mike Bibby. He was a good post scorer, good rebounder, and he had decent range. The one thing about him was he came up short often in the playoffs and big moments, which is most reflected in the Michigan series timeout call that wasn't there. But all in all, he was just a really good player. And like I said, I think he really gets the nod because if it hadn't been for the rigging the series in 2002, we may be talking about how he was also a champion that year.
Yeah. I mean, when you talked about the timeout call, it kind of just reminded me of something funny that happened in this past playoff series when Draymond Green
Yep.
did the
Yep.
same thing. But yeah, C Web was definitely a great player as well.
Yep.
And also his cultural impact, him along with Jalen Rose and the rest of the Fab Five.
Yep.
Just like when it comes down to college basketball, he was
Yeah.
definitely a huge inspiration and impact.
Yep. And then my last pick for my all-decade team was Amari Stoudemire. Routinely a 25 and 10 guy, amazing scorer, could finish with anyone in front of him and could finish over anyone. Wasn't really a great shooter, but at the same time, he could shoot from mid-range enough. Decent post game, but just his ability to get to the rim and finish even when really good defenders, most notably Tim Duncan, was in front of him, that really puts him ahead for me. Because in the playoffs, whenever they played Duncan, Amari's stats stayed the same, and he was able to compete with Duncan on a high level.
Yeah, Stoudemire was definitely a great player. Like he could jump with anyone,
Yep.
and just there'd be some plays that I'd watch him where he gets the ball in the post and he just turns around and dunks on them. Um,
Yep.
Definitely a great player, and like we talked about earlier on with Nash, like he was just in the perfect situation.
Yep.
Those two really complemented each other,
Yep.
and he was just an overall great player.
Yeah. I think the thing with him though is because he was on Phoenix and they played small ball, him being at the 5, it really took away on the defensive end just because he wasn't a great shot blocker or post defender, and that kind of held the team back at times. But still at the same time, his offensive regiment in terms of his scoring ability and his consistency throughout the years, it really elevates him to being on this list.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
So, Max, with that being concluded, obviously there were some players that didn't make the list.
Yep.
And I think one of the most glaring players that didn't make the all-decade team was Vince Carter.
I don't think so, my friend. Here's my rationale for why Vince isn't on this list. He only made an all NBA team twice in 10 years, which means he was only a top 15 player twice in 10 years. So why should he be on this list? He gave up on the Toronto Raptors while he was still playing for them. He said himself afterwards, I didn't try while I was on them. He never lived up to his full potential both on offense and especially on defense. So he never won playoff series regularly. He only made the conference finals when he was with Orlando and he was way past his prime. So I just don't see why he should even be considered for this list.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I was kind of going after like the whole like longevity thing. Like I think the players we've named on this list were all better than him.
Yep.
Especially the players at his position.
Yep.
They were all better than him. I just wanted someone to clear up that in case any of the viewers were watching that
Yeah.
noticed that.
I I gotta say with him, if he doesn't have that dunk contest, he is not remembered in history because sure he played 22 years. That doesn't mean you're an all-time player. And the fact that he had this tremendous dunk contest where he has these amazing dunks which had never been seen before, I think that really leads to a lot of people thinking he was a lot better than he was just because it was fun to watch him and to see him do these crazy dunks. But that just doesn't mean he was a tremendous talent. He obviously was a good player. I'm not saying he wasn't, but he's not a top 15 player. I wouldn't even say he's a top 20 player from this decade.
hmm Yeah, and I mean the only player that you could really like debate from my list is like removing T Mac.
Yeah.
And even him, like T Mac was a 7-time All NBA player.
Yeah. T
He was
Max,
also a scoring champ. So,
his best 5 years are better than Vince's best 5 years. And
hmm
the other thing is, some other guys we didn't mention, I'd rather have over him, like Chauncey Billups, Pau Gasol, Ben Wallace, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, Chris Paul. Those are all guys who had better peaks than he did by a long shot.
yeah,
So, anyways, now that we've concluded talking about who our best players are,
it's life.
so Hoxa, now that we've talked about the best players of the decade, do you want to talk about some of your favorite moments or plays from the decade that you can think of?
Yeah, for sure. So, obviously, when it comes down to like dunking,
Yep.
one of my favorite dunks is that lob from Gerald Green, where
Yes.
his head was at the rim and he just windmilled it. Um,
Yeah.
Probably one of the greatest lob plays of all time.
I think it's insane to see because his head is above the rim and the ball is at his chest. Then he windmills it. It's
Mhm.
not he's going up and he does it. He does it while he's up there. And I think it's just really insane to see a guy with that much vertical on a play.
Yeah, and then another one is one of Kobe's buzzer beaters where he shoots with his left hand
Yeah.
at the buzzer. That's another great one.
Yep. I think my favorite dunk is Dwayne Wade on Anderson Varejao
Oh, yeah,
because it's such a disrespectful play where he basically kicks him in the nuts while Varejao is over him, and he does it sideways. And if you're watching it, it's just a tremendous dunk, and his reaction to the crowd really sells it afterwards. In terms of individual plays, I think Allen Iverson stepping over Tyronn Lue, it's a very memed moment, and it's really good, and it really shows Iverson's personality. Where at the time, Tyronn Lue earlier in the game had gotten a few steals on Iverson, but then later in the game, Iverson fourth quarter crosses him over, hits the shot over him, breaks his ankles, and then walks over him. It really just sums up Allen Iverson's play style in terms of handles, scoring ability, and confidence as well.
yeah. But one thing that I do have to point out is, was it really an ankle breaker? Because he
I
didn't catch him off the crossover. He caught him
yeah
off the pull up, and like
yeah
Tyler was like going up to contest it.
yeah. I think I qualify it as an ankle breaker because when he trips, it's off the jump. So I personally think it's an ankle breaker, but it's one of those ones where it's just a matter of personal preference, really.
Yeah, and obviously Ty Lue is the victim. It doesn't matter. I'm sure Ty Lue sleeps at night, considering he got a ring
Yep.
uh,
He's
that series and also as a coach.
Yeah, he might win another one this year with the Clippers, but who knows?
Who knows?
Um, Other than that, I don't really think there are too many great moments from the decade, like in terms of individual plays. I think there are a bunch of really good games, like
Yeah, I was
LeBron,
about to point that out too.
like LeBron scoring 25 straight against the Pistons in the conference finals, Kobe's 81 points, Tracy McGrady's 13 points in 35 seconds. But I just don't think there are too many like amazing individual plays. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of some now. Like, obviously, every Vince Carter dunk ever.
Yeah, there.
Like when Vince dunked over Alonzo Mourning, I just
Yep,
remembered that.
yep. I have that written down where he's in midair, he gets hit in midair, brings it back. It's a crazy play to see. It's again where a guy's vertical can just, it's just astounding to see.
Yeah. Another one is the one where Kobe lobs it to Shaq, and
Yeah,
Shaq dunks it and
yeah.
points
I
to the crowd.
I think that's one of those plays where it's not really a amazing play, but it's just more like the timing and the iconicness, shall we say, of it, and just where it's this iconic moment between the pair. It's their highlight together, and it really just it put them over the top in that series as well, where it sealed the dagger against the Blazers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like let's put it this way: like Kawhi's shot, where it bounced around, right?
Yep.
That wasn't like the most impressive shot, but it probably is considered one of the best shots, if not the best shot of all time, just because of the whole circumstance
Yeah.
around it. Like how it was tied,
Yeah.
it bounced around. It was coming off a super intense series.
Yep.
Like,
And they won the title later on because of it. I think that's big too.
yeah,
One one other play I have here written down. It's not really an infamous play, but it's if you've ever seen Tayshaun Prince's chase down block against the Pacers in 2004, it's a really good play where you don't think he can make it, but he sprints down the court. It's like LeBron. And the other thing is it's really significant in terms of its historical value, as after he did it in 2004, the Pistons would go on to beat the Indiana Pacers and they'd go on to later win the finals. And that Pistons Pacers series was a grueling 7 games. So without it, maybe the Pacers get momentum. So in terms of historical value, I think that's up there in terms of best plays of the decade.
yeah. And I'm pretty sure there's this one play, um, now that you brought up the Pistons, of Ben Wallace blocking Shaq. Um, it
Yeah,
was either Shaq or Alonzo Mourning. I think it was Shaq, where
yeah,
Ben Wallace just stuffed Shaq. Like
yeah,
the strength needed on that block. It was like it was basically the same block as LeBron James on Thiago's splitter, but
yeah.
strength level was just on a whole different level.
Having to do that against Shaq, it's unreal because Shaq is always regarded as one of the strongest players ever. But Ben Wallace, for a guy who's 6'8", is right there alongside him too.
Yeah, especially when it comes down to strength.
Yeah, if you ever look at Ben Wallace, that's a guy you
You don't.
shouldn't want to don't want to mess with for sure.
I mean, like Ben Wallace's push on Ron Artest, or yeah, was it Ron Artest? Was just everything during House
That's
at the Palace.
that's another moment in the decade where that's an iconic moment where Ron Artest jumps into the crowd and just starts beating the crap out of a fan. I think it's iconic for all the wrong reasons, but at the same time, when you look at what happened, it derailed a Pacers potential title series. It really kind of derailed Artest's prominence as an NBA like almost all-star at that point, where he won Defensive Player of the Year, he won an All-Star the year previous, and he was averaging 25 points a game that season. So I think that's really an iconic moment from the decade, despite the fact that I mean it's probably one of the NBA's worst moments in history. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, well, especially since it was on like national television,
Yep.
that's probably the reason why it's the worst. Obviously, if you look at like the later decades, I mean, earlier decades, like there's a lot more stuff that was going on,
Yeah.
but a lot less people were watching it. And I
Yeah.
mean, like just like seeing like the anarchy going down
Yeah.
at the Palace, like the fans throwing popcorn and drinks at the players, like
Yeah.
and also engaging in fights with the players. This is some retro hockey type stuff. Like when the Boston Bruins went into the stands and that one player took the shoe off a fan. That and I think it was in like the 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
That's something you definitely wouldn't expect in the
No.
2000s.
It's especially crazy to watch because it goes on. It's not like Artest is fighting one guy. Him and Steven Jackson are getting like 6 or 7 different people. It's just a mess, but it's definitely one of the most iconic moments of the decade for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So other than those, I don't really think there's any other really big moments. There aren't any big stage buzzer beaters or finals amazing dunks or plays or anything. So I think that really just caps off and summarizes the best plays of the decade.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So with those in mind, that's the conclusion to our podcast on the 2000s. All in all, a pretty not great decade in terms of style and overall talent. But nonetheless, it did give way for guys like LeBron and Dwayne Wade to come into the league and for them to set the stage for the next generation. So, anything else you'd like to add on the decade?
I think I'm good.
All
Thank
right, then. Well, guys, thank you for watching. Make sure, if you haven't already, to give us a like, a subscribe, and a comment if you are so inclined. And we'll talk to you guys later.